Hey y'all, and welcome to Geospatial Experiences. I'm your host, Melissa Mayo, and I'm an Esri engineer on the product team. This podcast focuses on the application of geographic information. Let's go on a journey together with some of my amazing coworkers, along with Esri customers, partners, and distributors who are doing really cool work in the field of GIS. Hi everyone, and welcome to Geospatial Experiences. Today I'm joined by Clint Brown, Software Products Director here at Esri. He's joining me today to help wrap up our second season of guest interviews. Welcome to the podcast, Clint.
Well, thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I'm really excited about talking with you, and I can't wait for the listeners to hear what you have to say. So let's dive in if you're ready.
Yeah.
Awesome. We start every one of these conversations the same way by asking our guests to tell us about their geospatial journey. So essentially their career path for GIS. So how did you find your way to Esri? I would love to hear about your experience meeting Jack for the first time.
Okay, well, this is a long story because it's a lengthy story. So I started here at Esri in 1983, and before that I was working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I had been spending a couple of years in Alaska. Alaska had become a state in 1959, but it really took up until the late 1970s for legislation to be passed by the Congress to lay out a lot of kind of arrangements for Alaska lands. There were native organizations and people that lived in Alaska. There was the idea that there could be these national wildlife refuges, national forests, national parks. In fact, this legislation called ANILCA at the time had doubled the size of all those systems. And it also called for this accounting of all fish and wildlife resources, all natural resources, all Native American resources, and so on. At the time, we wouldn't have referred to those people as Native Americans, but I guess it's an okay term to use. So this act called for this accounting of all of the species, all of the habitats, all of these cultural resources. And the idea that people could go out and survey all of these things was one possible way to do it, but that would have taken decades. Mm-hmm. And it turned out that what people wanted to do was apply GIS to model it and kind of compute the results of these things. And there were many state agencies and many federal agencies, BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, National Park Service, etc. were all part of these teams that we all worked together to do things. And I found myself in a meeting with Jack and Esri were going to build a database of natural resources content that we could use to model these things. We started with an area called Bristol Bay. And Bristol Bay is a real famous part of Alaska. It's where the peninsula starts to come down. It's the richest salmon fishery in the world. Just amazing fish and wildlife resources. And you know, I was a 30-year-old person who got to participate in that. It was a lot of fun and an amazing education as well as an experience.
I bet you learned so much.
Yeah.
About so many things, honestly.
Yeah.
That sounds like an incredible experience.
Yeah, and part of it was Esri was building this database, and at the time, Esri had been implementing data collections for natural resources using something called integrated terrain units. And there's this idea that if you think about soils and vegetation and elevation and terrain and water, all these things tended to have a lot of common boundaries between them. And Esri had developed a methodology along with a smaller contractor that still does this work up in the mountains up above San Bernardino to capture these terrain units. So these scientists of various disciplines would get together and commonly derive these boundaries for these features, and they'd call where these boundaries would come together, and became a pretty amazing database that could be used for modeling natural resources. So we got involved in that. Let me see if I can think about how I want to talk about this. So maybe I should talk a little bit about Jack and what he was doing at the time. Mm-hmm. So it was interesting. There were all these 7 or 8 agencies from state and local, as well as these federal agencies working together, but none of us had a vision for how to bring it all together. Jack led some meetings where he started to help us kind of unify and come up with a plan for what we were going to do. It involved building one of these integrated terrain unit databases, but also how we could use software. And this was brand new software, like ArcInfo didn't exist at the time. There was some grid modeling packages, and there was PIOS. But those are the tools we used. And the team at the Fish and Wildlife Service, we were pretty good at modeling this stuff. I had worked earlier in my career with a team in Fort Collins, Colorado, and we had worked on a set of procedures for modeling habitat for animals. So we knew about suitability modeling and analysis, and just this natural affinity for using GIS for that became a big thing. So that's where I got started. That lasted about 1.5 years. Then I was ready to come back to the lower 48. My wife was pregnant with our first son. Jack called me on a July 4th. And, I talked with him for a little bit. He said, well, I got to go. I got to catch a plane. I'll call you in 2 weeks. And I didn't hear back in 3 weeks, so I called him. And he put Scott Morehouse on the phone. And that's how I got a job at Esri. And the job I had was to come work with Scott Morehouse, who was leading the development of this new technology called ArcInfo. That was 1983 when I got here. And Scott, I met with him. The first thing he said was, Clint, I want to handle programming. Take care of everything else. Here's a paper that I found about thinking about software as a product. And at the time, that idea was really new. And the idea that software would have a specification, a name, a release name, and the specification would be its capabilities and what was going to be built. And then the things that people were just beginning to think about was software products had a set of training courses for them. They had a series of well-defined releases that would come out every so often, and that idea of a specification that we would build to. So my first meeting with Scott, he sat down with me and he said, Clint, I want a program. I need you to take care of everything else. And he said, here's a paper about thinking about software as a product, and what did that mean?
Like an article,
It was a kind of a journal article.
Mm-hmm.
And it was out of some kind of journal that talked about that, and it laid out this approach for a product would have release notes, the specification for what was going to be built. That release had a name, like release 1.0 of ArcInfo and things like that. Products would have technical support. So people would answer phones and deal with problems. Up until that point, there were 4 programmers in Scott, and each day of the week, each one of them had a day that they would have phone hours to answer phones. So the programmers were taking calls.
Wow.
Until I got here. Then I became technical support. We also had a team of trainers. And then we also had documentation that needed to be written and testing that had to be done. And I became responsible for those things.
So it feels like you came in at a very critical time and at a very, just an important time in Esri's history.
Well, none of that existed before then, and it was my job to kind of invent it.
Mm-hmm.
So I did, and I came up with ways to do those things. The other thing that had happened is I had just been that year to the 3rd annual user conference. There were 13 customers there.
Wow.
Esri had a staff of about 30 people. So it wasn't a big operation then, and there weren't many resources, but that's how we got going. And we had a person who would go out and do training, and we soon added another person that would do that. And back then, what would happen is when ArcInfo got sold, Esri would also sell a computer with it. Initially, it was a prime computer. These were called mini computers. And they were pretty large in size. They needed a computer room with air conditioning and climate control and things like that. A lot of power would go into those spaces. GIS always required graphic terminals, and in those early days there were monochrome terminals, and at Esri we were fortunate enough to have one 16-color terminal. It's like,
that's incredible.
Pretty amazing. So and the software was just beginning, and we kind of had to figure it out, and part of it was by answering phone calls. And I started to answer these support calls every day, and it was fascinating to me to do that because these users were really the first GIS people. At the time, there was no literature. There was nothing. And finding it, there was no internet. It's like these things just didn't happen. So Scott and I he created these development teams and created a methodology for the software. I worked a lot on the practice of GIS. And the great thing about it, because I'd been to the conference, there were these people out in the community who really were creating the early methods for how to do things. So that's where things started for me. And in that first year, we didn't hire many people, but by the second year we were hiring more people. Primarily, we had this idea, because I was answering the phones and talking with people, there were these customers who were really amazing to talk to. They knew what they wanted to do. They were kind of developing and discovering their own approaches to things. Other people really had no idea what to do. And so it became really clear that we needed to set up support teams, but it also was becoming clear that we needed to have teams that would test the software. Back then, software engineers, just amazing people, were busy focused on new methodologies and algorithms and things like that. They really weren't ready to fix bugs, for example. And that became part of our role, is to test those things and to kind of provide use cases, reproducible use cases to programmers. Became a big thing of what we were doing. So we built up these teams. Support, we hired support people to answer the phones. We added more people working with. At the time, we were thinking of teams of two. Who could we combine with this programmer who knew a little bit about the application of GIS? So we'd have what we ended up calling a product specialist early on, and it later became a product engineer, and we'd pair them with a software engineer. And these software engineers would create the software. The GIS analysts that worked with them would test their software and also write about their software. And that's how we started working on creating these teams. The product engineering teams started from those early days. The technical support teams started from those early days. They were taking calls. Essentially what was happening is product engineers started answering phones instead of programmers. Mm-hmm. And what was interesting about the conversations is we were learning and discovering methods, kind of the best practices, approaches for doing these things with our users. Eventually that became technical support in a few years, and then in a number of years. Training services came out of that early work. Product engineering came out of that early work. Our writing and documentation and how we described GIS came out of that early work. What was interesting about it is the community also had a lot to do with what was going on then. It's like, we would have this conference, like we started with the 4th conference, and then the 5th conference is when to the San Bernardino Hilton for a year. And that was the first time I had come up with this idea, because we were still talking with customers on the phones. We were finding that some customers really understood the practice of GIS and were kind of inventing their own methods, that it was going to be real important that we try to capture that. And a lot of that became us kind of defining these approaches for what people would do. The other thing that happened in that time was we were doing a lot of testing of things and writing courses for teaching GIS. Basically, there was a 3-week course. The first week, we taught people how to use the computer operating system, because that was all new to people.
Oh, wow.
So, and a computer at the time, believe it or not, cost $500,000. So the people that got, the organizations that staffed people up to run these GISs, they were pretty intelligent organizations. They had this amazing, great leadership. And the thing we started to see is that there was this visionary person, but there was also somebody who was really good at the practice of GIS, whatever it was in their organization. So if it was a natural resources organization, how do you manage or model habitat? How do you model forestry? And a lot of those a lot of those disciplines had existed for a long time, and GIS was just coming into its own in those days. But it was a really interesting time, just fascinating to be a part of. And I started to recognize these patterns, like these teams of two that we had, and we used that on our development teams. So we wanted there to be, every programmer, we wanted there to be at least one product engineer that would work with that person and would work on the best practices and the geographic approaches for applying these tools. It's a really interesting time. In the first few years, we began to sell more and more software, and by the time we had the conference at the San Bernardino Hilton, we had that had 230 people at it. And at the time, because we were talking to so many people on the phones, one of the things we thought is, let's have users bring their maps and share their work. The other thing we thought about at the time was, how are the rest of these people going to learn GIS? I mean, when you got on the phone with customers, there were some who really understood it, and there were others who really were struggling and just didn't know how to get started because there were no resources for them. And what we started to realize is we could write documentation for that. So we began to set up those teams. We set up the conference. That year in San Bernardino, the other thing we did is we decided we would have workshops, technical sessions at the conference. And part of that was for us to teach what we knew. But the other part of it, and this is still something that I think is important, we're kind of forgetting to do it, is we need our users to teach us. And that's still true today in this day and age. So that idea that we could develop these new roles and the discipline of GIS became part of what we were trying to capture in our documentation. We were trying to build case studies of examples. So those were the really early days of GIS for how things were going. At the time, users were creating pretty amazing sets of information, but really nobody had much data. And if there was data, it was manually collected. It wasn't digital yet, and it was very expensive. These computers were still, they weren't $500,000. They were $250,000 kind of computers. So we were kind of all in it together. People were sharing their data with each other because we all needed data. But those early days, it was a real interesting time just to kind of recognize what was going on. Like GIS had this amazing integrative capability, this georeferencing of information. That was a big thing in the early days, coordinate systems, and how information could be brought together. But it was a really rich time for just thinking about the practice of GIS, and we started to capture that as our teams grew out. So we had this team of support analysts who were also writing about the product. We had trainers who were capturing that and developing a lot of the best practices for GIS and teaching that in their 3-week classes. The first week in that class, we would teach the operating system. Like these computers, people had a computer starting at the class, so they needed to learn how to operate the computer and how their GIS people would work with that computer. And that's That was the first week, and then the last 2 weeks we'd take people through the software, and we'd take them through by doing a project, some kind of project of some kind. They'd build their data sitting at a digitizing station. They'd automate all their attributes and combine that with their features, join them together. Then we teach them how to create models to present information, and then to create maps with that information. And eventually there was also aspects for data management that would also be talked about. So those were the really early days, probably into the mid 1980s and late 1980s. That's what was happening. And we started to grow at the time. We grew to where we needed to take the conference off-site to Palm Springs, which is just an hour away. So that was a really fortunate time for us. And just the growth of GIS in the community and the expansion of computing was happening at the time. One of the really interesting things that was going on in those early days of GIS was users were beginning to realize that every one of us needed data from somebody else. We didn't have all the data we needed. The great thing about GIS and early computing at the time was this georeferencing, where information could be brought together and overlaid. That was a big deal. And organizations would focus on, like a certain kind of organization would focus on the cadastre, on the parcel network. Some organizations would build the land records and the cadastre. Other organizations would build the transportation network. Yet again, other organizations would build things like hydrology and natural resources. So we started to see users focus and specialize on what they needed to build. Utilities were yet to come. It was still a few more years before that happened, but that started in the mid-1980s and into the late 1980s. And there were these partners that we started to see a role for how they could really just juice the industry with best practices and methods for their communities of practice, which is a real interesting time for us. That's pretty much the early days of what was going on.
What is it like for you to have been here for all of that? Because I feel like now you go to a conference and there's 18,000 people there, and you've been there when there were 13, and 13 people to 18,000. You've seen all the changes. You've seen all of the evolution of not only the conference but the company, how we do business, how things work, how things operate here. What is it like to be someone who has seen all of that and been so instrumental in really building those processes and procedures in that we still use today?
Maybe I can try to take you back to what was going on at the time. So at some point in the mid-1980s, Jack came back off the road from somewhere, and he came to me and he asked me a rhetorical question. He said, "Clint, why do you think everybody uses IBM?" So imagine that. These were the days where that was the computer that people had. And he answered his own questions. That's because they start using IBM before they ever write their resumes. I have this idea for a university site license. We can provide ArcInfo for 1/10 of the price for 10 times the number of users in these organizations, and we'll also build a workbook and start teaching GIS, and the university community can help create this industry, this workforce. We didn't think about it that way back then, but that's exactly what happened. Like Jack started this, I wrote up the spec of a thing called the ArcInfo University Site License, and he was selling that and delivering it all over the world. And we started to have these universities create these people who knew GIS. And the way that happened was fascinating. Like early on, we wrote the first book. It was called Understanding GIS, the ArcInfo Method. And the reason why it was called that and not Getting Started was that it was 450 pages. It was very detailed in what it covered. But we thought, geez, if we call it Getting Started and it's 450 pages, our competition is just going to tear into us and get somewhere. So we had a meeting over at this famous taco stand a few blocks away called El Burrito. And we sat at a picnic table out back and said, well, what is this book about? And we decided it was really about the methods and practices of GIS. And actually, that's what the chapters did. And it turned out to be this great book for classes. And we decided to name it Understanding GIS, the ArcInfo Method. And it's come out a number of times since then, but it's probably to this day still the most used textbook for GIS. Interestingly, there were about 4 of us that worked on it. There's a young lady who now is a retired librarian from Nova Scotia at Dalhousie University named Gwen McNairn, who did a lot of wonderful work on that book. There were also other people like Michael Waltuck and Rupert Essinger, who are both gone now, but did wonderful work with that. At the same time we were developing that, we were developing our training teams, and just a couple years after that, the University of California at Santa Barbara, SUNY Buffalo, State University of New York at Buffalo, and University of Maine joined forces to build a process called NCGIA, which developed new curriculum. Like Michael Goodchild from University of Santa Barbara led a lot of the effort. He came up with, and a number of other professors and great thinkers in the field came up with about 75 different subjects for teaching GIS, and ultimately they built the GIS Book of Knowledge, the BOK as it's known today. But these guys had built these early courses, and universities everywhere, first across the United States and in England, but then all over the world, created the GIS workforce. Like in those late 1980s and early 90s, the workforce just appeared magically in all these organizations. And I know how hard that work was in these universities, but it was just incredible what happened, that things just took off. And that idea that GIS was going to be an industry that was still yet to happen, but computing was getting more and more powerful for less and less money. The internet came about in the late 90s. That idea that people everywhere could share information. I mean, it's kind of an amazing concept that all digital content is now somewhere out on the web. It's not that you have access to everything, but the things you need to have access to, you can typically find. And the amazing thing about about the GIS community is that sharing ethic. And like we all were so in need of information, and it was so precious that the community responded. That's where the Open GIS Consortium came from. And people think it's all open source. It's really about that open access to information, and that's still true today about users and how they share their information. That's not to say all information is shared by everyone just openly. No, a lot of it's really restricted. So communities of practice like wildlife biologists and conservation will share information about species at risk with each other, but not with everybody. People who want to manage parcels, they'll share that data with selected customers. Utilities, the same way for what they're doing, and that's just like businesses are all doing that same thing. But that early idea that information would be shared, that a lot of it, like in the national government, it's really interesting if you start to look at Jack's new book on the power of where. There's 490 maps in that book. About 90% of those maps involve the use of shared information. That's how important it is in our community. And those early days just kind of set the stage for that. And it's just continued up until today. So that's kind of those early days, the early first 10 or 15 years of GIS.
So we've talked about the early days, and now you're the director for the software products group. So what does that mean as compared to kind of how what you were responsible for back then? How has that evolved, and what types of initiatives are you responsible for now? What part of the business do you influence?
Well,
it sounds really similar.
It's still the same practice, but it's grown and expanded and become incredibly sophisticated. We have large teams of people that work on products. We have people that are deeply trained in various aspects of GIS to do that work, but it's still the same work. We have more people working on this stuff. We have a lot more customers. The conference has grown from, dozens of people to tens of thousands of people. This year, there were over 40,000 people. About half of those were on site, and the other half tuned in on the web and got connected. Computing grew up during that time. Data expanded during that time, and we all became strong at the practice of GIS, and the work that product engineering continues to do really relates quite strongly to the best practices in each domain. Think of each domain as a kind of an applied area like forestry or electrical utilities or local government or cadastral or climate, things like that. All these people have developed models and methods, and especially information models that they share with each other. And today it's kind of fascinating. If you think about all digital content is actually being shared somewhere on the web, not necessarily openly or where it's accessible by everyone, although a lot of content is, and it's just tremendous content. But that's probably the biggest shift that's taken place. Is now there's so much investment in building that content, and that continues, but there's so much content that can be brought to life in all our GISs, and kind of how we work is really using that web pattern. So in the last 2 decades, that's been the big shift. This, first of all, I'd say probably the last 15 years, this the growth of web GIS. Let's call it community GIS, because information sharing is such a critical part of that web GIS. What maps are has changed. So it used to be all maps were these static documents. You look at a map and you create it, and some people say there's two kinds of maps. There's reference maps and there's maps with thematic content in them. But my sense about it is there's still print maps and static maps that people create. They're gorgeous and they're beautiful. And then there's maps that people use on the web, and those maps have become something quite unique. I like to talk about maps as apps. Mm-hmm. That's a really big thing. If you think about a static map, once you produce that map, it's starting to age. And what you see is what's in the map, or what's in its legend, or what's on the back of the map. It's really quite limited in what can be provided, although these maps are just absolutely gorgeous and beautiful, and they have an impact and an effect on people that, maps are art, and maps are a lot more than just art. There's science that's being presented. It's just really fascinating. But along come these digital maps, and what they are is something new. Like every map that you look at, it's not just what's in the map. And this is kind of interesting to think about. You can reach into that map. You can reach through that map into all kinds of data, and that data is just available on the web. Because you have identity and you're a member of a certain organization, that means you have access to certain kinds of information that not everybody has access to. But that means you can build new kinds of experiences with these digital maps. And the fact that a map has that ability to just kind of pull forward some information, those of you who've been doing GIS for a long time, that's a lot more than just an identify. Mm-hmm. It's really, you're creating a report out of that information. You're using the very latest and best practices of your community to create experiences for your users. And that's what's been happening with the web. So we saw the web coming. One of the early ideas we came up with is we said, well, maps, those old GIS maps, we used to think, well, we don't know how people are going to use these maps, so let's put all the layers in the map. So we had, sometimes 30 layers in the map. And we turn off most of them, but just the few we needed. Now, with a digital map, we wouldn't do that. We'd say there's a base map, and there's a few overlays that represent what we want to show in that map. Base maps plus operational overlays, and then perhaps a few reference layers that add context for what you're looking at. But that's a new pattern that's happened. So maps have become these applications, like a dashboard. We've all used, I'm sure, the Johns Hopkins coronavirus dashboard and other dashboards. Well, everybody needs dashboards. We figured that out in the early 2000s, that dashboards were going to be a key application. And then in 2020, this student named Ensheng Dong, he just started a PhD program at Johns Hopkins, went to his major professor, Lauren Gardner, and said, my parents are back in Wuhan. And with this COVID thing that's going on, I'd really like to create a dashboard to show my parents so they can see what's going on. That became the first dashboard. It was built in 2 days. That's how amazing GIS has become. All this data is available, or you can search for it and then mash it up into maps and bring those to life. It's just kind of amazing. And Dr. Gardner looked at that. She said, well, yeah, we can do that, but let's make it open. Let's do it for everyone. That's actually the story behind that. Esri helped along the way. Our Living Atlas team was writing to Dr. Gardner and saying, hey, we notice you're getting a lot of traffic and a lot of hacking that was being done on that map, and we helped them harden their application and do those kinds of things. But just that idea of this new kind of map that's an app, that's really the beginning of what's happening now. And everywhere, people are building these amazing apps. Like even GIS users are using map-based apps for automating data for their particular domain areas and their geographies. But that's really what's taken off in GIS, is this idea of maps are now apps. They're not just the information that's in the map, they're the information that's behind the map, and that can be all information that's available anywhere in the world can be brought into their GIS.
Do you feel like this, with this evolution into this new kind of web mapping space, do you think it's changing our business model and how we do business, or changing how we think about it and look at it and how we kind of communicate to our users?
I think it's going to change every user's business model. And that's actually what's kind of fascinating. Like there's so many of us that still are doing desktop GIS. And let me say, that's God's work. Desktop GIS community is building amazing content all across like 680,000 organizations worth of content. Just imagine that. It's not just for the world anymore. It's for planets and things that go beyond just our own Earth. But that's one of the things that's going on. The other thing that's going on is the idea of these applications. So yeah, there's dashboards, but there's all kinds of applications that can be built. This community that's building that content, they're also building a lot of amazingly sophisticated analytics these days. Think AI. What's going to happen with AI? Well, a lot of that's going to be about how to model things and how to represent things. These early days in AI, one of the things that's working incredibly well are these models that derive information out of imagery. One of the things that's been happening in these past few years with analysis has involved the use of the amazing satellite imagery that's been collected and been served. Like Landsat 8 has been wonderful, but what's really interesting these days is the European Space Agency's Sentinel-2 satellites, but there's others that we'll talk about in a little bit. Sentinel-2 is really about still the same idea of land cover classification and things like that. Sentinel-2 has some AI models that have been built for it by a team of people at an organization called Impact Observatory. And they built these techniques to take existing training samples. So training samples are things that organizations do to call out and identify a particular location and what its land cover type is. And then there's this idea that those can be derived by looking at other spectral collections of imagery. So they had tens of thousands of samples that they used AI to turn into over 1 million samples worldwide. If you know much about Sentinel, Sentinel is 10 meter, Sentinel-2 is 10 meter imagery. It's collected about every 4 or 5 days, there's a new pass. Over every location on the planet, there's a 10-meter pixel that's collected once every 5 days.
That's amazing.
And this idea that you can apply this AI-derived collection of training samples to the planet means that we can derive land cover. And what's been happening now for the past 7 years is land cover has been created at a 10-meter resolution across the planet, one time for every year. So imagine you take not just one sample of pixels for one point in time, but the entire year's worth of pixels to create this land cover map. And that's a methodology that Impact Observatory developed, and Esri worked with them to create that. So every year for the past 5 years now, that's been turned into an annual land cover map for the planet at 10-meter resolution. It's kind of amazing to think about. Mm-hmm. And that kind of content is, there's so much of that, like Sentinel-1 is using SAR, synthetic aperture radar collections that are really about other kinds of content that can be collected. Things about water, things about ice coverage. Ships on the ocean can be observed. They can't be identified, but they can be sensed. Like, where are all these ships? It's just amazing amounts of content that are starting to become available. And a lot of that's happening because of AI and what AI can do in that remote sensing space. At all levels of detail, like in utilities, the idea that you can look at equipment and identify damaged equipment or equipment that's in good shape. That's pretty amazing that can be done with all kinds of sensors these days. Is really pretty amazing. So a lot of what's new is also what's been here for a long time. Like, think of the John Snow map about cholera. And this is almost 200 years ago, where John Snow started to map the locations of victims of cholera who passed away and where they lived. And he started to see a pattern between that and these pumps. The various residents in that part of London would visit certain pumps because they were close to their homes. So when he started to map out these cholera cases on the map of these victims and the locations of pumps, he could identify one pump specifically. They said, well, just take the handle off this pump so nobody can get water here. They'll have to go to another pump. And they turned that epidemic around. Like, it's kind of an amazing event that happened before the advent of anything called GIS, but geography was working then. And those things are happening now at just completely different levels. Like there's people counting elephants based on aerial surveys, aerial photography, and just using AI to select those animals out of those areas. There's other cases where people are using, it was really interesting. I met Maasai, a tribal member from Tanzania, at the conference. It turns out she'd studied GIS and got her degree in GIS. And one of the things they're doing in Tanzania is the tribes are herders. So they have cattle and probably sheep and animals like that. They built enclosures for those animals with these trees that have thorns on them. But the other thing they started to do is string chain link fence in these circles around those thorn trees that actually do a much better job at keeping predators out, like lions. So the lions don't take their cattle. In return, the tribal members don't respond by killing lions. So they've lost one lion or something like that in this area since then. The other thing that's going on is the technology now. All of these tribal members, they're in their traditional clothing and what they wear, and in their bags they have a smartphone. They're using GIS and collecting data with it in the field and observing, and also looking at maps to see what's going on in a larger context wherever they are. It's really a fascinating time in just seeing how GIS is going beyond these things. That same thing is happening for lots of other kind of remote sensing work around these spaces. One of the really interesting things about these maps, these web maps, and their ability to stay up to date and to become these digital tools that people can use is, what are all the things people do with those maps? Like, one of them is a lot of field collection. Just an amazing amount of observations are being made with those devices now.
So I want to shift gears with you a little bit, Clint, if you're okay with that.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to talk a little bit about leadership. What are your thoughts on leadership, and what does it mean to be a good leader? You have a huge team here. You have a lot of people who work on a lot of different things, and you're definitely influential around Esri. So what are your leadership thoughts?
My thoughts on leadership are one of the things that's really important to me is I feel like I'm really just part of a team. And it's really about what the team does. Like, teams are a lot more than just adding the number of people, and that's a team. It's like adding the number of people, and then there's some kind of multiplier for what the team is able to do by collaborating and working together and having trust in each other. And that's kind of what's always worked for me. We've always had the idea of teams on our work. Like, early on, we were thinking of teams of two, back when it was a programmer and a product engineer. And we've also had other kinds of teams of two for how we present and things like that. And we really like teams a lot around here. And I think the other thing I think about leadership of teams is, if I'm not willing to do the work, I don't feel comfortable asking other people to do it. I am very comfortable with learning more about individual people's talents and skills and handing work their way for them to really excel at what they do and to deliver on their best work. And I really enjoy watching people work together, where they're working in complementary ways, where each of their sets of talents and skills is being used to create new software, to create new ideas, to write about the application of GIS, to build new kinds of models and methods, and, create new, like if you look at one of the most amazing teams at Esri is the Story Maps team. There's a team of programmers and software engineers who build wonderful technology but the way the editorial team writes for that and works with other customers and educators in that space is nothing short of just extraordinary, what they've done, and how popular. Like, I had no idea that we'd see the kind of adoption and uptake as we've seen. It's just amazing. The other thing about story maps is that's a great way to get into GIS in the first place. And that's happened for a lot of people in classrooms. So over the years, the one kind of role that people think about when they think about our team is for a long time we called everyone product engineers, but in these last few years that's expanded. We have writers now, and Molly Zern and Elena Hare and a number of other people manage writers and hold writing workshops across Esri. One of the big things about what we've been trying to do is to write less about us and more about the practice of GIS. And a lot of times those practices are really, we're trying to be the voice for our customers and what their practices are. I think that's some of our best writing. Our blogs, I think, really reflect that in such a nice way. Our blogs are a lot about reporting and new news about our products from our really strong product management teams. But the writing I enjoy the most are the writing about practices. And I think that's been so effective because we can, these days it's really wonderful to engage with a lot of our customers and to tell their stories and to present what they're doing. Their practices are so wonderful in this field. I think that's the big thing. If I just look back at my career and what it's been really just trying to enable our customer base to, first of all, to really adopt some of the best practices from other customers. Like, how can we share those with them? And then just to see the results of their work. And a lot of that, like the individual work that's used within their own organization, I don't see a lot of that. I see just enough to just wish I could see a lot more, because it's just amazing what's going on in the community. It's one of those professions where it's really a lot about what other people are doing that makes it so fun. Like it's been a real honor and privilege to support this really large geospatial community. I couldn't think of anything better to have done with my life and to continue to do with my life. I still enjoy it a lot.
You're very you're very hands-on with your teams too, as far as being involved and interested in what they're working on. You seem curious. Just in the length of time I've known you, you seem curious about what we're, not from a micromanagement perspective, but just an honest curiosity of what's the community doing.
I'm still learning.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I want, if there's anything, if people can just continue to remain, never be satisfied with where you're at. There's still more to learn, and there's still more to figure out. There's so many problems we face, I think this next decade is this year of applied GIS. We're all going to learn, and we're all going to teach each other, and it's going to take all of us working together. It doesn't matter if our philosophies have us think that open source is better than commercial or whatever. We all need to work together. There's so many big problems that we face. There's problems inside of organizations, problems among a few organizations that partner, and goodness knows the problems we face. We need the GIS community to be involved in everything that's going on in the world. You know, I was talking with Roger Tomlinson. Like, GIS isn't just technical, and it's also artistic. It's both. It's both this left brain and right brain kind of experience. And it requires a certain kind of personality. Sometimes we talk about those people as having Renaissance personalities. Mm-hmm. That's one of the things that's been so wonderful about my career. That's who I've worked with, is these Renaissance personalities, not just here, but for our it's like just an amazing community of people, and the practice of that and what they're doing and what they're working on is so worth our time to really support. And it's a real privilege and an honor to get to work with all those people and to have had the experience to see the results of their work. What's interesting about the results of their work is a lot of people aren't even aware of the impact their work has. Like, so much of the information that this organization or that organization builds, nobody's ever thinking beyond their own organization in many cases. They just don't get to have the privilege of seeing what other people are doing with that information or doing with the practice that they created. I mean, like, we all see it. And I think it's one of those things that just keeps us all going here. Like, we are a privately held organization, but it's an interesting organization. Jack runs it more like a nonprofit. Mm-hmm. So we're fortunate enough to have had strong revenues, but 30% of our revenues we invest into the technology, and we grow our teams that way, and our development teams and what we work on. That's just really fun and exciting. That's why we all come to work on our teams. Now, if you look at our users and what they do, like, every user is doing something in the world that's really important. Yeah, there's a few that may not be my cup of tea. I haven't found many yet. Just everywhere I go, people are really trying to make the world a better place, trying to conserve, trying to balance things. How do we live in balance with our world? And I think that idea that what we get to do as these GIS practitioners, as writers, as testers, we want to use the software in the ways that, not just the way our users are currently using it, but we want to envision where they're headed and how they might be using it later on. That's a real privilege. That's nothing to ever look down on. It's just so amazing that we get to do that.
What do you feel is unique about Esri that someone external might not realize?
I think one of the unique things about it is it takes people from all over the world. Software companies are that way everywhere, but the thing that kind of disturbs me about the current fight about borders and things like that is there's so much value in humanity across the world. In the United States, we're going to need a workforce. We aren't going to grow that population ourselves. We need for people to be coming in from other places. And just like what we do and how we do it, how we work on it, really requires a global community of participants. It's not just us, also, it's our users. It's our users worldwide that help us get better at that. I think that's one of the wonderful privileges that we all have. We get to go to this conference every year and see amazing work from all over. It's really remarkable what's going on, and every year is just it's a privilege, and it's such a highlight of my life to get to do that. You know, somebody this year who'd been to the conference for a lot of time said, Clint, I figured I've spent a half year at this event in San Diego. And I thought, yeah, kind of. I don't think it's a half year. But if you stop and think about it, so the conference has been going on since 1996 or 97 in San Diego. It's 1 week a year. And you do the math, and it turns out that it's, 26 weeks. That's a half year. Mm-hmm. And what better way to spend a half a year of life than just learning and seeing what this community of people are up to? It's just amazing.
It's always an incredible experience, and it never disappoints from the map gallery to the sessions and the presentations, and just being able to see what people are doing from everywhere, from all corners and all over the all over the globe.
There are problems we're beginning to work on where it takes everyone. Mm-hmm. If you're an open source proponent and that's what you want to do, great. We need to be working with you, not in kind of conflict with you. Regardless of what you say to us, we're going to try to work on these things going forward where it takes all of us, because there's just so many huge problems in the world that really are going to rely on our communities to really take these things on and do something about them.
Where do you see the future of GIS heading?
Well, hopefully what happens, and especially I think this book will help create the next generation of GIS practitioners, are thinking of just GIS as being something that's for use within our individual organizations. It's also becoming something that's really society-wide.
The power of wearable, you mean?
Well, I think GIS is too. It's just, that's the great thing about geography is we all live together in it. Everything comes together in this global, this universal space. And I think that's the next big aspect of GIS. People talk about modern GIS. When we say modern GIS, we're thinking community GIS, that we're all working together, sharing, open about it. I mean, there's a lot of content that's not going to be shared because it's so critically important for a single organization, but there's so much of what we all use that is shared and should be shared. And I think that goes for the best practices of things. Like there's so much we can learn from our users, and there's a lot we can teach to our users. And I think we can do that in humble ways and in ways where we just continue to recognize that none of us have all the answers, like far from it. And that's one of the things that I love about the spirit and ethic and the culture here at Esri. It's just so wonderful that way.
I tend to agree, even though I haven't been here a super long time. So, it's been a really fun experience to kind of learn those things and become a part of the Esri culture and family, if you will, and really, kind of get immersed.
We're certainly very thankful to have you here.
Oh, thank you.
And to be a part of it. You're so smart and so well versed in a lot of things that the rest of us aren't. So it's great to have you here.
I appreciate it. It was almost a year ago we were in here for my interview, not just
wow.
a couple of weeks out from it. So
That's nice. That's really nice to hear.
Mm-hmm. So Clint, what drivers do you think will push the technology to the next level? What are the drivers that you feel like will be important?
Gosh, first of all, technology is just going to continue to advance. AI is going to be wonderful. I think AI has been oversold and overpromised, but I think a lot of when we are at our best, we are thinking critically, not just about what we're working on, but about how we're approaching that work. And I think that's a big aspect of what's going to make AI reach its promise. I think there's so much that's possible with that. And just seeing some of the things that are already underway and going on is really exciting in that space. Even a few years ago, people were taking a flight, you could call it a mission, to gather high-res imagery for a city. And they were counting every car in the city. Okay, you can't see what's in the parking garages and stuff like that, but at certain times of the day, that like that, all of a sudden, there's 500,000 cars in, let's say, certain parts of Washington, D.C. Kind of amazing. Like, well, what does that mean in terms? Just think of all the thing that translates into. It translates a lot into commerce, but it also translates into air quality and what do we do about our cities? How do we move away from that? Like that, again, back to that example of Los Angeles that we talked about earlier, just that idea that there's people living in Los Angeles as if they're in New York City or Paris, France. Mm-hmm. That's something we have to do in every city. Like we can be more bright and more creative about our world. And I think that's going to be, I think there's a lot of people, I just think in all these spaces, just almost every human activity I can think of, GIS has a role to play. And I'm sorry I can't be here to see what it's like in another 40 years.
Well, we want you to hang around as long as possible.
Well, I'll try to be here, but...
What do we as Esri, how do we stay ahead of the game? How do we stay ahead of the game with these technology trends and where the future's headed with technology?
So I think we continue a lot of what we're doing, but I would say one of the things, every time you're getting comfortable with what you're doing and you're rightfully patting yourselves on the backs for all that we've done, just also have a little bit of paranoia or a little bit of critical judgment about what we're working on. Yeah, we're clever and we're smart, but there's so many things we haven't even considered yet that we need to address. Like I think the world stands a chance with GIS. Stands a chance to kind of move beyond what the politics of the day are. We just need a new generation of politicians that hopefully won't return. Like, could we return to, not in every way with the old days of, but our early leaders were visionary and smart about a lot of things. Mm-hmm. And we need to get back to that. GIS is becoming, it's becoming more of the awareness about geography and GIS has really expanded, and I think that's what excites me about the book. Is I think this is the book that can be the, I don't know, is the Johnny Appleseed of GIS the right kind of thing? It's the thing that I think will really spread the word and kind of the depth of what GIS is about. And I think we as a company have an obligation to deliver on that promise. So we want to continue to build great technology, continue to build the great practice, but also really reinforce these kind of the ethics behind GIS. There's so much that we can improve upon in those spaces.
I think that's awesome. The book feels like a catalyst, almost a catalyst for inspiration, not only for the people who are already in the field, but the field of GIS, but also people who are going to be coming up and getting exposed to it and really showcasing, like you said, some of these, to a whole new generation, these ideas and these concepts.
That's really nice. Mm-hmm. You should say that too. The team promoting the book. Those are really nice words.
I have one last question. For you today, Clint. Okay. And then we're going to wrap up. And you've talked about it a little bit, but I just wanted to give you another opportunity to wrap it up with a nice little bow here. What would you like your legacy at Esri to be?
Oh, man.
It's the tough hot seat question of the day.
I really don't expect to have a legacy.
I think you already have one.
Well, I'd rather just be working behind the scenes, and I just want people paying enough attention to what I'm talking about that they're trying to expand on those ideas and take it further. Mm-hmm. That would be my legacy, I think.
That's a great one. I think that's awesome. Thank you so much for your time today, Clint. I really appreciate the conversation. I think it's been amazing. It's been so inspiring. It's been educational, and it's everything I hoped it would be. So I really appreciate you.
Nobody cried.
Nobody cried, yeah. I do really appreciate you coming on as a guest.
Thank you.
So, mm-hmm.
Some people are going to cry listening to that much.
No, they won't. They won't. My conversation with Clint is one of my favorites I've had so far. I found the discussion about the early days of Esri to be so just interesting and insightful. It feels like information that all of us who are complete geogeeks and are complete and total fangirls and fanboys of Esri and Jack and everything that's a part of this industry that we work in, we just want to know that stuff. It's such a curiosity for how this empire got started, and Clint had such amazing information. I was just fascinated listening to him, and the more he talked, the more excited he got about different things, and it was so cute to see him go through that and think back on his experiences and his journey to Esri and his journey with Esri. He's seen so much and been so influential. He's been a part of so many things that have really become kind of foundational here at Esri as far as how our groups are established and designed and set up and the way we operate. It's just so interesting to kind of dig into that and learn more about it, especially as one of the newer employees at Esri. I just found that to be really, really interesting and really just a fun conversation. I don't know. I have lots of thoughts about this. I just love talking to Clint so much. He was so sweet to spend time with us today. I felt like it was just a really good conversation, and I just loved it so much. And I just really appreciate Clint for taking time to come on and share his journey with us. So I hope everyone enjoys it as much as I did. That wraps up today's episode. Please feel free to reach out with your comments, or if you have an interesting topic that you would like to hear, please let us know. Thanks again for your time, and tune in for our next podcast.